I'm just going to run through the sort of historical context of the water company's involvement in highways drainage, which seems quite pertinent following the comments from the gentleman on my left. The current legislative framework as enacted, funding arrangements, because it always comes back to money, doesn't it? What some of the challenges are, and some alternative approaches that we're looking at the moment. So, historical context. I think it was coming through quite clearly this morning. Historically, obviously, highways drainage, along with most other forms of drainage in an urban environment, all lay within the sort of the public sector, be it local government, national government, etc. And even with the creation of the regional water and sewerage companies in 1974, that didn't change. It was still within the public sector. And a lot of the sort of duties and the legislation really still dates from that scenario. With the privatisation of the water industry in 1991, the property drainage function alone, and I appreciate that property drainage, that's still a lot of grey areas within that, was transferred to the private sector. So highway drainage remained within the public sector, so that's where you've got this sort of separation of responsibilities that we still have now. However, in an urban environment, and London, which I know fairly well, the two systems are seldom discrete systems that are unconnected. It just never made sense to have separate highway drains and surface water drains for runoff from roofs and properties within the same street. So, the legislative context, like a lot of the responsibilities of a sewerage undertaker, they actually originate with the Public Health Act 1936. In the case of highway drainage, section 21, and I don't know if you can make out there, but the sort of salient points of that paragraph are that any sewer vested in the county council, as the highways authority, can be used for the drainage of premises and streets, i.e. can be used as a public sewer. Similarly, any public sewer vested in the local authority, as was then, may be used as a highway drain by the county or highways authority. The other thing to pick up from there is upon terms which such terms as may be agreed between them. So I'll just move. The next section really just talks about where you have cross-boundary sewers, where you have the flow might be treated in the sewage works managed by another authority. Two authorities can't make an agreement about highways drainage without the consent of another affected authority. And lastly, basically, either authority can't unreasonably refuse to enter into an agreement for highways drainage or property drainage, or insist upon unreasonable terms. Bear in mind the context of the time that this was to ensure cooperation between, say, a county council and a district council. So, you know, two parts of the same sector. Now, if we roll forward rather, 50 years through various intervening pieces of legislation, we have Section 115 of the Water Industry Act 1991, which is what we're currently working with. Those sections there basically say exactly the same thing. Any highway drain can be used as a public sewer, any public sewer can be used as a highway drain, subject to whatever terms or agreements are acceptable to both parties. Again, if it flows into another authority's area or treatment works, their consent has to be agreed. And lastly, it's on whatever terms both undertaker thinks fit. I don't think there's any more. And then that last part really is just saying exactly the same thing. You can't unreasonably refuse to enter into agreement, and the terms of any agreement must be reasonable. I mean, an example, we were approached during the construction of the M25 for the diversion of a sewer which ran under the intended route. The Highways Agency said, well, actually, while we're at it, how about us draining that section of the M25 into your trunk sewer? Those were reasonable grounds to refuse an agreement. But, you know, simply disagreeing on the ground, you know, refusing to enter into an agreement on, you know, we don't want to provide extra capacity, or, you know, we just don't want to get involved in highway drainage, there'd have to be a good good reason why not. So that's the legislative context. Just to summarise it, highway drains can be used for draining runoff from properties. Public sewers can be used for draining runoff from highways. Connections are subject to agreement. Whilst on that point, I inquired of colleagues if I could have an example of such an agreement, and they produced for me a pro forma agreement with all the blanks to be filled in. But even colleagues who'd worked for the company for 30 years couldn't lay their hands on an actual existing copy of an agreement. More on that in a second. Grounds for refusing connection must be reasonable. Terms and conditions must be reasonable. Legacy highway connections under the Highways Act, from whenever the relevant date, which is usually the date at which the highway became maintainable at the public expense, if I remember the wording correctly, from that date on, any existing connections into public sewers or vice versa become, set in stone, as it were. So legacy connections are there to stay. And I think probably the vast majority of connections in somewhere like London have already been made, and they're there to stay. As I said just a moment ago, under what terms they were made, I can't find any evidence in the midst of time and the many transfers of responsibility and ownership. Things like that have probably gone by the wayside, unless anyone has any in their archives to produce an example. So whether those agreements had sort of limitations on maximum flow rates or maximum volumes, I've no idea. I couldn't find an example. Or if they had any sort of sunset clauses in them, again, I don't know what a typical one would be. So that's the legislation within which the water and sewerage companies operate with regards to highways. Funding, how would we pay for highways drainage? All of our investment is planned for in 5-yearly AMP cycles, asset management program cycles, and we define the benefits of any investment in 4 output measures: quality, which is environmental; base, which is basically serviceability, maintaining existing performance; enhancement, which is, believe it or not, flooding is regarded as enhancement. But whether that's the philosophy is that flooding happens, so if you try and stop it, that's making it better, or odour. And growth, which is defined in terms of extra connected properties. So there's nothing, the observant among you will have noticed that there was nothing in there about additional funding being secured on the basis of extra lengths of highways drained. Obviously, where you have estate roads, residential roads built, in theory, there'll be corresponding properties along them with people who will pay water bills. So there is a funding stream there. Where an existing B or A road becomes widened to 4 lanes or extra gully pots are put in, there's no mechanism to trigger any extra funding to cope with the increased runoff. Now, when it comes to flooding, which is probably one of the biggest issues of interaction between the sewers and the roads, how is flooding defined by Ofwat? I'm not going to read word for word, but basically it's either internal or external flooding from a public sewer. Internal flooding is internal to a property, it's come over the threshold, it's come through the air bricks, it's below a suspended floor, or it's in certain types of attached outbuildings. External flooding, not surprisingly, is flooding which is not classed as internal flooding. It says for reporting purposes it will be split into curtlages, highways and other external areas. So finally highways gets a mention in some of our definitions. But the performance of flood alleviation schemes, and therefore the cost-benefit analysis, is always based around the number of internally flooded properties. The way it tends to work, you have to have a certain number of internally flooded properties to make a project float, really, if you excuse the choice of words. But you can then, if that is cost beneficial, if the cost per property to address those internally flooded properties is not too high, you can then often justify addressing external flooding, including highways. And I've got an example coming up, but if you have pure highways flooding from a public sewer, there's no explicit driver, according to Ofwat, for water company investment. So, to sort of sum up, what are the challenges all this represents? Water companies have no explicit remit for highways drainage, only an obligation to enter into reasonable agreements with highways authorities to cooperate. There's no direct funding mechanism. You know, there's a sort of a indirect one where if more roads equals more properties, that equals more customers and therefore more revenue, but it's not a direct one related to roads. No defined standards for performance. So just as we have, you know, targets every AMP period to alleviate a certain number of internally flooded properties, we don't have targets on the basis of number of kilometres of roads alleviated from flooding. Ownership of assets is often unclear. Very often all we see on our map of sewers is foul sewers and public surface water sewers. Whether they are one and the same highway drains or whether there are separate highway drains that we don't see is often unclear. And another which touches, this morning was talking an awful lot about water quality and the water quality impacts of highway runoff. An awful lot, if not the vast majority, certainly in London, of highway runoff discharges via water company outfalls. Now, we're used to funding programs to clean up polluted surface water outfalls when they're polluted by misconnected foul sewage. But our mindset is that runoff, rainwater, regardless of where it's come from, isn't a water quality problem. Of course, everyone's having to come to terms with the fact that that's not actually the case. And in the case of highways and roof runoff, it can have quite a high pollutant load. So our surface water sewer outfalls that we were quite comfortable about, maybe we shouldn't be. Now, I mentioned I was going to give an example of the type of difficulty we face with highway flooding from sewers. Brent Cross, the A41 junction with the A406 North Circular Road, two major trunk roads join there. It's an Olympic route, has one of the UK's largest retail centres located nearby. Flooding disrupts the traffic 3 to 4 times a year. The worst example we had was about 12 hours, but not a single property was affected. As you can see, the area is a sort of a mixture of light industrial, retail, commercial, with some residential. The site's actually a former sewage treatment works site that was decommissioned in the 1930s. It's a natural low point. And a lot of sewers converge on that area. The problem, speaking to people from Barnet Council, they think the problem's been around for about 40 years or more, which would sort of date it from when those major roads or that junction was built. The resolution of it, you can sort of see I think that was the 12-hour event. It took 12 hours, not for the flood water to drain down, but for the knock-on effects in the traffic congestion, because the North Circular obviously serves the north of London. The A41 is a major arterial route, so the knock-on effects, it just rippled outwards in terms of congestion. However catastrophic that may be, according to the water industry, that's not a driver for funding, because no properties were affected. So largely as a result of the Greater London Assembly's Drain London project, which brought together a lot of the drainage authorities in London to try and sort of, this is going back to sort of 2008, 2009, to try and encourage better cooperation between the authorities, we started talking with TfL as opposed to exchanging letters at director level. And they were able to provide us with the evidence base and the justification we didn't have, because when this happens, people don't phone Thames Water, they phone the TfL call centre. And whereas we have absolutely no evidence that this happens other than photographs, they had thousands of call logs, and they were able to help us using their expertise to calculate the economic impact of an event like that, and they put it at around about £250,000 once you factored in all the disrupted journeys, all the damage to commerce, etc. So with their help, we were able to secure a solution which should be delivered during this AMP period. But I should stress it's purely the huge volume of traffic passing through that intersection that was able to make it cost beneficial, even then only just. And it's a one, I think, in our area at least, it's a one-off. I don't think that indicates probably the way forward of us being able to justify major civil engineering schemes to alleviate pure highway flooding. So, how might we improve the situation? Certainly, I think that last case study showed better communication and cooperation is essential. We were sitting there thinking we have no problem we can prove. TfL was sitting there on a mountain of evidence, justification. Until we talked to each other, nothing happened. I think better understanding of the interactions between these shared systems, both upstream and downstream, and that cuts both ways. SUDS, I think we've got to start thinking the unthinkable, SUDS and source control. We've heard a lot about permeable road surfaces and trying to, in terms of flooding, trying to attenuate at source, and in terms of water quality, trying to remove pollutants at source. Definitely the way forward. We're carrying out trials of sustainable urban drainage in an area of West London at the moment. We're just about to launch it. And Friday we were walking around surveying some of these streets, looking at these four-storey townhouses with marble steps from the street up to the front door and listed building status, wondering how we could try and get some rainwater butts and some permeable paving onto their property, ignoring the fact that there was a space this wide in front of the properties made of black tarmac. Then we started looking at, well, what do we do in this space? This is a major source of runoff, but it's a major source of space as well. Flood storage and routing on roads. I know that normally gets highway engineers quite excited. we may be having to look at that. I mean, keeping roads passable in a 1 in 100 year event at the expense of flooding properties internally, is that the right prioritisation? And more collaborative solutions. I'm convinced in my paranoia that there's a huge bow wave of investment coming along for all of us in terms of the Water Framework Directive. I don't think we'll be able to tackle things like diffuse pollution the way that we tackled the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive in the 90s, end of pipe, focusing mainly on water company investment. I think we've got to look at the whole from source, pathway to receptor, and I think we've all got to work together on that. Okay, I think that's me.